So today we're going to be talking about the introduction to ecology. And while the new AP Bio test derives around 4 big ideas, you're going to see components of each of those ideas in the ecology unit, but most of the ecology unit is going to derive from big idea 4, which is biological systems interact, and these systems and their interactions possess complex properties. And so this is where most of ecology is going to be found, even though we are going to at some point talk about big idea 1, 2, and 3. 1 having to do with evolution, 2 having to do with free energy and how organisms grow, reproduce, and maintain homeostasis, and big idea 3 about how they store, retrieve, transmit, and respond to information. But most of the biological ideas that we're going to talk about in ecology are going to be on the 4th big idea. So what is ecology? It's the study of interactions with the environment. And not all organisms interact with the environment in the same way. As you saw a moment ago, clownfish with the sea anemone, and they have a symbiotic relationship that is beneficial to both of them. Whereas other fish in the ocean may not have the same biological relationship, and sea anemones are generally very fierce predators. So again, when we look at ecology, we're looking at how organisms interact with their environment. And we're looking at the abiotic factors, things that are not living, such as water salinity, oxygen in the atmosphere, dissolved oxygen in the water, nutrients available, and the biotic factors, other organisms. First, let's start back at the basics. So, levels of organization. When we talk about a living thing, we can go from the biosphere, which is the largest chunk of this pie here, because that's pretty much all living things are encompassed in the biosphere. And as we move down, we go into individual ecosystems or biomes, and which I'm sure you've had some familiarity with, the taiga, the tundra, grasslands, deserts, deciduous forests. Then you move into communities, down into populations, and then individual organisms. But at the organismal level, when we're talking about biological organization, the organismal level, we can go all the way back to DNA and the cellular level. And so I just want to be sure that you understand that when we're in ecology, we're really going to be talking about this pie structure over here on the left, but we can go all the way back down to DNA if we want to talk about how organisms were organized. So what are the different types of ecology? So ecologists look at the environment, they run experiments, they make observations, and they do this to test for distribution and abundance of species. And so there are 4 main different types of ecology. You have your organismal ecology, which really is looking at one type of organism and how they interact with their environment. You have population ecology, which is looking at the impact of the number of these species in a given area or location. You have community ecology that studies how organisms interact with each other and the environment. So they're looking there at abiotic and biotic interactions within a community of different organisms. And ecosystem ecology, which really looks at the study of energy flow and chemical cycling in a given area. So let's look at this category and see if we can figure out which type of ecology this research question would be investigating. How do trout select a mate? What type of ecology is that? Well, if you chose organismal ecology, you are correct. Let's try another one. What factors control photosynthetic productivity in a tropical rainforest? So photosynthetic productivity, that's going to have to do with how much chemical energy is able to be converted from the sun, and that would be ecosystem ecology. What factors influence the diversity of species that make up a rainforest? So here we're looking inside of a specific area, and that best answer would be community ecology. So if you did good with those, then you should be in good shape. If not, you should go back to that slide and make sure you're aware of the differences in those. So when we look at any environment, we are always looking at abiotic and biotic factors. Abiotic factors would be things that are not living, and there's a dotted line down this slide, and to the left of the slide are abiotic components. So we're talking about all the gases. all the cycles, excuse me, the water cycle, the sulfur cycle, the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and anything that those components would contribute to on the abiotic side. And then you have the biotic side. So it's how other organisms interact with each other, what they eat, what eats them, how their feces contributes to the chemical makeup of the soil in their area. And so you have these biological components. And what this slide is really looking at is the first law of thermodynamics. So the purple arrows are basically showing you that in any conversion, when you go from producer to consumer, or producer to decomposer, or from consumer to decomposer, you're always going to have some energy that is converted or transformed, which is the word that we prefer. You always have in an energy transformation, you're always going to lose some energy to heat. And the reason for that is there's no organism or system or even a non-living system that we have right now on Earth that is 100% efficient. So it's important to understand that whatever goes in has to come out, but oftentimes you have a part that comes out every time that we're aware of. In biology, you have a part that comes out that is actually lower quality or heat. If you've had chemistry or physics, or you've heard the word entropy, it's the same thing. We just refer to it as heat when we talk about it in environmental science and in biology. So these purple arrows are reminding you that you're always going to have some sort of heat released at each stage, and eventually that's going to actually flow back out into space. So when we look at ecology, one of the things that's really important to understand is these cycles on the left-hand side, the matter cycles. Okay, so whatever we have here, it cycles through and it moves to a location. Sometimes it can move greater locations, sometimes it can't, depending on what type of cycle it is and how it does transformations. So matter cycles, but energy flows. And the distinction between that is that eventually this heat is going to go back out into space. So it's not quite a closed system when we talk about energy, but when we talk about matter, it is a closed system. So that's pretty important to understand that. This is just another slide showing you the same thing. It's driving home this point about the idea that matter cycles with the red arrows, and that the yellow arrows are indicating that at every conversion or transformation, again, transformation is the preferred word, every time we transform energy from one form to the other, when producers transform solar energy to chemical energy, you're going to have a loss of heat. And this slide is just driving home the difference between matter, which is cycling, and energy, which is flowing out of the system at some point when it's reduced to its lowest quality and unusable form. And this refers to the heat. When we talk about the heat, we're talking about matter. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. We're talking about thermodynamics. We also have another second principle of physics in there, and that is the law of conservation of matter, or law of the conservation of mass. I don't know how you learned it. And at this point, either of those are correct. But basically it says whatever you have in this system that's closed, that's all you ever have. So when you're writing a chemical equation and you've had to learn how to balance it so you have the same number of carbons on the left side as the right side, that is due to the law of conservation of matter, conservation of mass. So even when you have any kind of conversion or transformation and you're turning something into something else, you're still going to have to account for all the components at the end, even if they're waste or not usable. So let's talk about the importance of abiotic factors. And so what's important to remember about abiotic factors is not all organisms can live everywhere. This is a coral reef, which is considered an extremely diverse community. But you couldn't drop an antelope in there and expect that it would be a suitable environment for that. You couldn't drop other water life from maybe a freshwater zone, because coral reefs are salty and exist in salt water. And so all of these things, the suitability of an abiotic, the components of an abiotic system, impact who lives there and how successful they are able to be. And so when we're talking about these abiotic factors, it could be water, it could be temperature, it could be light, it could be salinity, it could be amount of dissolved oxygen, all kinds of things. It could be anything that's not living that can impact it there, precipitation amounts and climate, etc. So what's important on this new test is being able to look at data or a graph or chart and understand what we're looking at here. So this is a test that looked at the effects of two organisms that like to eat seaweed. And so what they did is they looked at the seaweed coverage, how good the seaweed coverage was when nothing was going on, when both the sea urchin and limpet were present, and that is shown by the red arrow. Then they took out the limpets, which is a type of algae-eating animal. They took out the limpets, and they still didn't see the seaweed rebound. So we didn't have a high percentage of seaweed cover. Then they took out the urchins, and they saw that when they took out the sea urchins, they had this blue line. And when they took out the limpets and the urchins, they had this purple line. And as you can see, this purple line goes up very steadily, very quickly, and then it levels off. And we have a name for that leveling off that we're going to talk about in other parts, and that is carrying capacity for the seaweed in that area. But what it wants to know is which of these organisms, based on looking at this graph, has the most impact on seaweed. Who eats the most seaweed? And so you should be able to look at a chart like this and determine that certainly the limpets have a small impact on that, but the sea urchins have the greatest impact when they're removed from the system in terms of seaweed being able to thrive, and even when you remove both, being able to actually get to carrying capacity. So sea urchins would be the organism here that had the most impact on seaweed. And those are important things to kind of always check yourself in the textbook or whatever resources your teacher is providing you, to make sure that you understand what you're looking at, and don't try to jump to conclusions based on like a base of store knowledge. What the new test is really looking for is to see if you can kind of think about things and look at things and make decisions based on what you're looking at. So the Earth climate varies by latitude and season, and we have these macroclimates, and these consist of patterns on a landscape level, regionally, or global. So this is really big when we talk about a macroclimate. Then we have this microclimate that really is looking at the patterns that you're going to encounter at the community level. So like underneath a fallen log, what does their microclimate look like? And what that determines is what organisms are going to be able to survive there and be successful there, and what organisms aren't. And so when you have changes in this climate, rapid changes, or you have a catastrophic event like a forest fire or a flood, not all organisms are going to be able to adapt to that catastrophe. And so it's very important to understand that climate plays a huge role in who can be where and how successful they can be. And you need to keep that in mind as we move through that. So seasonal variations in light and temperature increase steadily as we go towards the poles. That's an important concept for you to understand. So as you move away from the equator, either way, you're going to have variations in light and temperature. At high latitudes, you have this axis of the Earth that has an impact on how often they get the sun. And then you have belts of wet and dry air straddling the equator, and they shift throughout the year as the Earth the Earth revolves around the sun. And then all of these things too are impacted by the changing wind patterns that affect the ocean current. Changes in the Earth's climate can have a profound effect in the biosphere. There are some organisms that are very tolerant to change and very tolerant to differences in temperature, but we have a tremendous amount of organisms that aren't as tolerant to temperature. So it's very hard for them to adjust when there is a major temperature change, and what that temperature change does to the abiotic factors as well as the biotic factors in that area. And so one way we predict the effects of future global climate change is to study previous changes. And so we look at glaciers, tree patterns, and different kinds of things as to try to determine what's going to happen in the future. When I was in Alaska, we were visiting the Mendenhall Glacier, and they had marks from back every decade, and they were showing you where the glacier used to be and how far it's receded since the 1900s. And it was quite shocking when we would run into one of these posts, because we would be so far away from the glacier, it would be unimaginable to even think about the fact that the glacier was there less than 50 years ago, and now we'd walked a really long distance from the glacier, and the glacier had receded that amount. So we really look at a lot of different things when we talk about global climate change. It's not one area of science that has the sole piece of evidence that the climate is changing. It's really about looking at a whole bunch of different things, especially species that have difficulty dispersing. And out of a certain range, they're gonna experience the most trouble. So let's talk about that. Organisms have to maintain homeostasis and this internal environment despite what's going on outside. And you have organisms that respond to these abiotic changes in one of two ways. You have the regulators, and they maintain a nearly constant internal environment regardless of what's going on outside around them. And then you have the conformers that allow internal environment to vary. This occurs in organisms whose environments remain relatively stable. So you're only going to find conformers in areas where the environment is pretty stable and not going to have a lot of big swings between a big spectrum of change. And so when we look at this and we look back at how the Earth has changed over the last 225 million years, when we had Pangea and all the land mass was as one, and then we moved into Laurasia and Gondwana, and then 65 million years ago to the present, we've had these mass extinctions of organisms at different times in history, because these continents have moved into very different climate areas, and they've moved into different areas as they've broken apart and shifted on the plates that exist, the tectonic plates of the Earth. And so it's really important to understand that we understand these mass extinctions, and we've also understand how we've had organisms that have survived on multiple continents that share very similar characteristics with a cousin, because they once were evolutionarily, they are cousins, from Africa before they split. But we've also had a lot of organisms that weren't able to make that transition. So I just have a slide here that shows some historical biogeography, and you're going to study this some more as you move into ecology. But this is showing the area where these guys were back before things broke apart. And then you can see some of these organisms were able to survive, and they had a big range, especially this leaf here had this huge range. But as Antarctica moved further and further south, these organisms had a harder time maintaining homeostasis and not being affected by the changes in climate, precipitation, and the abiotic factors available to them as they shifted. So this is a slide that looks at leopard distribution, and the red is showing the former range, and the green is showing the present range. And so we used to find leopards all up here at the tip of Africa, and into up above Asia. And now we had this fragmented situation with the leopards where they were cut off from each other. And now presently only this dark green area has leopards. And so when we fragmented this land, what happened was that a lot of leopards weren't able to survive, or perhaps they were harvested in that area for some general reason. But it really looks a lot about fragmentation that had the biggest impact on the leopards and whether they were able to survive in that area or not. And now they're all concentrated in mid to lower continent of Africa. So they have the largest distribution of any wild cat, and although the population has been showing a declining trend and are fragmented, we have seen some positive things coming from the leopard. Within the sub-Saharan Africa, the species is still numerous and even thriving. but it's important to understand that they have a very limited gene pool, because what's happened is there, because so many organisms were actually lost when we had this fragmentation, we ended up having a very shallow gene pool. So propose answers to why you think that you have this declining population of leopards. And how we do this in science is we have a chart, and this serves as a starting point to understand limits on distribution of a species. So species is absent because dispersal limits distribution. Yes. Area is inaccessible or insufficient time. No. Then you move into the next distribution limit, which is behavioral. So let's look here. So behavioral limits distribution. So when we look at behavioral, we're talking about habitat selection, yes, or no. Biotic factors such as other species, or perhaps they have a predator, disease, inability for any of those kind of things. So if your answer is no, we move on to the next one, which is biotic factors. I'm sorry, that's where we really should have talked about species and etc. if you were able to say no to behavioral. And then you look in here at predation and parasitism, competition with other organisms, disease. And if your answer here is no, then we're going to look at abiotic factors and whether they limit distribution. So chemical factors that limit the distribution, not enough organisms available. I mean, abiotic factors like not enough nutrients, not enough water, anything like that. So when we look at biogeography, we kind of go through this step to look at chemical and physical factors to see how they would impact. So at every stage you ask yourself, was there a dispersal issue? Could they not get through? When they first started building dams, we had issues with salmon being able to not go upstream to lay their eggs and spawn. And so the area was simply just inaccessible. So it had a dispersal limit. If that isn't the case, then we would move on to behavioral limits and look at that organism and sort of figure out, was there a problem with the habitat? Was there something in that behavior that made that organism stay in a select area or not be able to move forward? And if the answer to that is no, then we would go and look at biotic factors. And if the answer to biotic factors limiting distribution is no, then we would go down to abiotic factors and look at the chemicals factors, which include water, oxygen, salinity, pH, soil nutrients. So you're looking at the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycles, and then physical factors. How much light are they getting? How much temperature do they get? How much, do they have routine catastrophic events? Moisture, anything like that. Okay, that concludes the introduction to ecology. Your teacher can provide you with additional resources and in terms of being able to go back and look at things that maybe you wanted a clear understanding of. And this concludes Introduction to Ecology. Thank you.